Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 38 transfer plans, and it's a little bit sad to say that, but it is going to be the final transfer plans of this FPL season. Thank you guys so much for watching the content so far and really supporting what we've been doing on the channel. Of course, we've got a couple more videos to go on top of this video, which will be the cheat sheet, the team selection, potentially even a free hit draft as well. For those of you guys who have been patient and have kept the chip so that you can go for that final Game Week 38 punt, which I'm sure, of course, will be influenced by deadline leaks, but then also, the ability that you can maybe manipulate your players based on changes in Game Week 37, right? For example, if let's say Spurs lose, the impact of maybe Spurs, Champions League football, etc. These are kind of things that your Game Week 38 free hit draft can radically change based on, right? If you want to hedge around players who in theory have something to play for. And I guess, for example, even with Liverpool, you can argue that positionally, they've got nothing to play for, but there is the Jurgen Klopp impact as well. So we'll discuss those things in separate videos. But for me this week for Game Week 37, we have 84 points. We're sitting at 1,558 in the world, which is a lovely rank. I was very sad, of course, a couple of weeks ago, particularly after Game Week 34, where it just felt like my FPL season had basically completely crashed and burned. But I think we've done really well after taking the -16 to recover as much as possible. And when I look at my team this week, the two major rank threats left are actually Dubravka. Sorry, not Dubravka, but actually Petrovic and Dan Burns. So those are the two players that I'm competing with, and I'm competing with them really with Onana here on the bench boost and with Malo Gusto. Now, Gusto only featured as a substitute within Chelsea game, but it was nice because there was a convenient little thing where Chelsea had conceded 2 goals, right? And obviously Petrovic owners had basically matched Gusto. And Gusto also had a goal scoring opportunity. He was playing right wing at one portion of that game, which was very interesting. However, Reece James was the one who actually got an attacking return instead, despite Gusto being fouled inside the penalty box. But I won't complain because, of course, a lot of things have gone my way, namely Pedro Porro, for example, being a good free transfer used, Guardiola as well. Just consistently going absolutely crazy. And I mean, just talking about Guardiola, I think I have to say it is fortunate, right? Of course, you could say based on the outcome of the game, he could have had a hat trick if he wanted to take the penalty. But at the same time, of course, I think you just have to respect that, okay, even if Guardiola's playing left wing at times, a brace, for example, and a clean sheet is an absurd outcome, but we'll take it. And who knows what we can get versus Tottenham away from home. So that is something that is keeping me a little bit hopeful. Son, of course, continuing to be quite boring, to be honest. I think a lot of people who, probably have gone against the grain here and sort of ignored Son in recent weeks have actually benefited a lot within FPL. Potentially even when I think about my own team here, ultimately, maybe the hit that I took for Son hasn't been worthwhile. Whereas obviously in the case of Gordon and Foden, they've gotten pretty consistent points, and I can't be too upset about it. As far as the rest of my team, though, pretty template, I would say. No other differentials other than Vicario as well, who can really drive my rank, up or down the field. So as I said, it's just also depending on whether Dan Burn or Petrovic do anything that's outside the box, right? For example, let's say if Brighton, miss a penalty, if Dan Burn scores a bullet header, that's what would destroy my rank for this week. But I think I'm in a good spot for now. I've been very fortunate as well with the Saliba return as well. Him getting triple bonus points is pretty significant compared to the players of the world who own Raya or Ben White. Raya also very kind in getting a yellow card, so he took himself out of the equation in terms of getting the maximum amount of bonus points too, because I think at one point he was actually 1 bonus point ahead of Gabriel, who ended up with 1. And as I said, so I have a couple differentials for this week, so I think we're in a good spot, but it definitely means that on Game Week 38, we've got plans to sort of punt around certain players. What I'll do in terms of Game Week 38 is actually look at the fixtures and sort of just walk you through them and sort of my opinions on the fixtures. I think one thing that we think about in terms of teams that genuinely have something to play for when it comes to their position within the table and whether we want to target them. Clearly, I think Arsenal is in that camp, City is in that camp, but we probably are 5x'd or 6x'd over these two teams, right? So I think for the managers who have gone on that sort of wildcard 35 path, who haven't kept triple Arsenal within their teams, this is obviously an opportunity for you to invest into that third Arsenal player, or maybe even that second and third Arsenal player. And I think they're definitely a team that you'd like to own because they just simply have something to play for, and you know that they'll fight tooth and nail because outcomes can be ridiculous, and you never know as well. For example, let's say if Spurs get a result versus Man City, then of course everything is to play for in Game Week 38 up until the 90th minute. So that makes Arsenal players even better. Now, talking about the remainder of the teams, I think with Brighton United, I think this is a pretty dull game, but I think a lot of players do own assets from these two teams. What I will say is that Man United have been a shocking team as of late. I just can't really imagine them getting a serious result away from home. So if I own a United personnel or asset, I'm probably not that interested in them. The same with Brighton as well. João Pedro, if he comes back, may be interesting, but I think a lot of people transferred him out as well. So transferring in a Brighton player is probably not something I'd be that keen on, even though I think Man United are probably at their absolute worst right now. Having said, of course, the performance at Old Trafford versus Arsenal was actually pretty good, or maybe you can also put it down to Arsenal not playing at their absolute best in that game. But I think the reality, of course, when you look at that United team, is that it is very weak. And honestly, it is close to being a relegation side, particularly if Bruno remains out. So that's quite significant. I would probably say at this point, though, I wouldn't necessarily consider Brighton punt unless we were in the situation where I think you can consider someone like Pascal Gross if you're really keen on the penalties and João Pedro's out of the game. As far as Brentford versus Newcastle, this is an interesting one because obviously Brentford are completely safe, but Newcastle do have something to fight for in terms of European spots, at least at the time of recording for this video. I think this is obviously a tough game, right? I think a lot of us do own Newcastle players already, whether it's defenders, whether it's attackers. And the reality, I think, is that, yes, Newcastle have just been really poor away. And Brighton, that game sort of reinforced once again what we expect from this Newcastle team, right? Except that Newcastle were actually at home and their performance was really poor. And I just think that the only point to mention is that Brentford have been very solid at the back recently, outcome wise and performance wise, but it generally just shows that, even though they've been quote unquote on the beach, because they've avoided relegation for quite some time now, Brentford have actually consistently gotten good results. And I think that win versus Bournemouth says a lot about, the strength of this Brentford team. At the same time, you can argue that teams that actually are fighting at home have something to fight for, even though they're quote unquote on the beach. And this is another opportunity where Brentford are at home, so I think that's nice, and it honestly just makes me want to continue to bench Newcastle players, and I'll talk about that with my own team later. Burnley versus Nottingham Forest, this is not really a significant game. Obviously, it's likely that Nottingham Forest have to fight because there could be some ridiculous circumstances where Luton could actually come out victorious and sort of secure themselves, I suppose, a Premier League spot for the next season, but it is very unlikely. I just think that obviously Nottingham Forest is a team, if you, let's say, have already considered owning a differential in Gibbs White, maybe Callum Hudson-Odoi, maybe Wood, just because you're restricted on budget, they could be certain players that you can consider for sure. As far as Chelsea, Bournemouth, once again, Chelsea are also, contending and vying for a European spot at the time of recording. I think Chelsea players, what's nice about Chelsea is I feel that Pochettino isn't going to sort of look at this as some sort of circumstance to play the young players that we've never seen before, because the reality is that this Chelsea team is young anyways. They have quite a significant amount of injuries, and whatever team that we've been seeing so far that has pulled out some great results recently, I think will just continue to do so. So the way I see it, Chelsea players are actually really good for this week, because Bournemouth, once again, you can argue they're on the beach. They're away from home, and Chelsea, on the other hand, are at home, and they have a lot to play for in terms of everything going for them. And players like Jackson, players like Palmer, even maybe a defender that you have, very easy plays for this week. With Crystal Palace here, this is an interesting one, because I think, depending on the outcome of the Spurs versus City game, it might be the case that Aston Villa arrive at this game and they're technically the team that's on the beach, because they would have already secured a Champions League spot. However, another thing just to mention is that Crystal Palace have just been an insanely good team recently. The Crystal Palace that we've seen at home under Glasner, after a few weeks, I think, of sort of acclimatizing to his methods and things like that, it seems like this Crystal Palace team is absolutely firing. And of course, the usual suspect in terms of the trident of Mateta, Olise, and Mateta. I think is and sorry, and Eze is going to be very exciting for a lot of managers. So definitely something that I'm going to be looking forward to, especially as they are one of the home teams with budget players. So for example, for the managers who are looking for the Salahs of the world, you very well could be using Mateta as a make weight. You could be using Eze or Elise as well as a make weight. And I think that makes it very interesting. With Liverpool versus Wolves, this is an interesting one, right? Because Liverpool are clearly on the beach. Wolves are on the beach, and you can see that they're getting absolutely destroyed week on week, right? So we saw the sort of capitulation versus City, and we also saw their demise versus Crystal Palace. What I would say about that game, though, is it's very likely that Jurgen Klopp in his last game with Liverpool, I feel, will rotate quite a fair bit, right? They don't have something to necessarily play for. So someone like Salah, who we usually expect to play 90 minutes a game, I'm not so sure if he will play 90 minutes a game here. He did play the full game versus Aston Villa, and he played relatively well. Although actually, when it comes to goals and assists, obviously he wasn't on the score tally. Elliott looked a little bit more interesting. Gakpo had a good chance as well. But obviously within this Liverpool game, we're talking about players like Gakpo, we're talking about players like Salah. I think, based on leaks as well, you could maybe consider as well going for Robertson. He was benched versus Aston Villa, so that usually tends to lead me to suggest that he will play versus Wolves and start there. But ultimately, probably the player that could be most interesting from this week, actually, outside of Salah, I would say it's probably Trent Alexander-Arnold. So for the managers who might be in some sort of ridiculously weird, unique position, or even considering a free hit, Trent is someone that I think I would actively seek. As far as Luton versus Fulham, I think Doughty's interesting. Maybe Morris is interesting. But beyond that, let's be honest, you probably have enough money in the bank to expend on a Crystal Palace player, and I'd probably be a little bit more confident in them instead. Maybe not on defense, of course, because Doughty, I think we always talk about how he has intangibles with set pieces, but beyond that, I think, not that interesting a game. Man City, of course, you probably just want to triple up. I think there's not much to talk about here. Sheffield United and Spurs, both teams, arguably could arrive at this fixture with nothing to play for. Sheffield United oddly have some pretty poor home results this season. Not odd in the sense that we expect Sheffield United to be poor, but actually they've been uncharacteristically bad at home, and the results have been extremely poor. So I think that would be interesting for Spurs, right? It just depends on whether, of course, you think, given the injury list that Spurs have, is it not just going to be a simple game where your Sons of the world, your Johnsons of the world just play 90 minutes? Even Madison arguably could be playing 90 minutes once again, just because the squad is so depleted. I think that's very likely the case. And of course, Sheffield United have just been poor all season long. Yes, of course, they can score versus Spurs. I think that's very likely, to be honest, given the state of Spurs' defense and just how often they concede from sort of different opportunities, whether it's set pieces, whether it's an open play, things like that. But I still think that Spurs are definitely one of the teams to sort of look at, just because Sheffield United are really that poor, right? When you look at, for example, teams like Burnley or Luton, it's not like their counterparts are extremely strong offenses. I think even with West Ham, of course, you have players that are very good on offense, but it's not necessarily the case that, or rather Fulham, sorry, that it's not necessarily the case that Nottingham Forest or Fulham are exceptional teams away from home either, right? Fulham, we usually categorize as a team that have been very good at home, not necessarily so good away. Nottingham Forest, of course, generally over the course of the season haven't been a very strong offense, although recently we've seen great chances, particularly from their performances at home. Now, away is slightly different. And as I said, of course, with Spurs, you have some pretty big guns like Johnson, etc., etc., that could be very interesting. But I am tripled up on Spurs. And so when I look at my team this week, I've got one free transfer and 1.3 million in the bank. The way I see it is that I could actually play 4 defenders right now. I think Guardiola is an amazing play. Porro is an amazing play. Double Arsenal defense is an amazing play. So if I was to actually choose 3 defenders this game week, I actually think it's quite tough to do so. I probably have to be choosing between Saliba and Pedro Porro, if I'm honest. Guardiola and Gabriel, I think I'll just be keeping for the time being. Gabriel just for the set piece threat. Guardiola just for the overall threat. And Pedro Porro, of course, he's a great attacking threat, and that doesn't really change, particularly when you get to play for Sheffield United away from home. So the only thing that sort of makes me think that I'd like to go Porro is it could strangely be quite an interesting differential going for, playing around maybe an Arsenal struggle versus Everton, because from an effective ownership standpoint, I stand around 1.6k in the world. If I'm supposed to get into the 3-digit territory, what I probably need to do is bet against something. And I think that there is an opportunity for me within my team to maybe bet against Arsenal altogether. Maybe it's just by just dropping Saliba and playing Pedro Porro, but I think this is a valid opportunity to consider playing double Spurs. Hopefully they get their first clean sheet in, I don't know, forever how long, but that could be something that I consider, because I'm definitely not going to play Onana over Vicario. I also have one free transfer. I don't really want to go Vicario to Alisson, especially after what I watched within the Aston Villa game. Not that, of course, Wolves have a comparable offense to Aston Villa, but just the overall quality of the defense for Liverpool, a little bit lacking, let's just be honest. As far as the midfield, though, when we talk about that, Saka, of course, is someone who we knew coming into the Man United game. Arteta had mentioned that there is a doubt over him, and he clearly was struggling with pain. Now, over the course of the season, we've heard, as reported by Arsenal insiders like Team News and Ticks on Twitter, that he's been carrying this injury all season long, and there's no plans for him to really rehabilitate on it until after the Euros is over. And unfortunately, it's sort of a case where Saka is at times touch and go if the pain gets very bad. And I think if you guys recall the initial Man City game of the season where Saka was out of the squad entirely, that is a good example of what can happen when Saka is feeling immense pain. And some people would like to say that the performances, when they're poor, Saka, starts to limp. But I also think that, to give him the benefit of the doubt, he's a brilliant player anyways. He's been extremely consistent, and one bad game isn't going to make me suddenly decide that I'm going to go off of Saka. But however, I think given that I have one free transfer and a pretty strong team, one thing I will say is that if Saka is out, as confirmed by Arteta, it's very easy for me to just move into someone like Kai Havertz, for the purposes of taking a punt on Arsenal. However, given that a lot of people, in my opinion, will also be going to Kai Havertz or going to Saka, if Saka's out, for example, what I think could be interesting is just simply going for someone like Olise, right? Olise is a very good pick for this game week. He is someone who is at home. He is someone who hopefully, could even be on penalties. We don't really know. I think Eze is probably the one who's on penalties, but there is a chance, right? If he draws a penalty, it's very possible, in my opinion, that he could take a penalty. So I like Olise a lot as a pick to sort of replace Saka. So I think he's definitely one option that I could think about if Saka's out. Otherwise, of course, I simply have access to someone like Havertz. However, I don't have access to someone like Salah at this time. I also recognize that I can go for someone like Luis Diaz as well. But whether I really want to do that, honestly, no. I just think that his minutes could be reduced. And overall, I just haven't been extremely high on Luis Diaz, even though he, at some points in the season has been nice and kind to my team. So with Saka as well, I think the logic around Olise can just apply similarly to Gordon, right? Because with Foden, Palmer, and Son, I find it extremely hard to sort of bench any of these players, right? Foden has something to play for. He plays versus one of the worst defenses in the league in West Ham. So Foden for me is an absolute lock. Palmer is at home. Son is away versus Sheffield United. So these are opportunities with pen takers where I'm not going to sort of throw them away. Gordon, however, is away from home, and this is such an easy opportunity for me to just play Olise and move into potentially a 3-5-2, right? Because if we take the sort of understanding that a lot of people own Newcastle players and that maybe they'll play Newcastle players this week where they're away from home, and we know that Newcastle have not been particularly good. I mean, this isn't a good opportunity for me to simply play a 3-5-2 if Saka's totally fine. I go for Olise from Gordon, and this would allow me to have a very strong team ultimately where I can bench my Newcastle players, where someone like Isak could have very high ownership, but maybe we could argue has a little bit of downsides, right, in terms of his overall fitness, for example, the early substitution in the previous game. But we'll talk about that when we talk about the forwards now. So with the forwards, I think Jackson, Haaland, and Isak, that's an interesting one. For me, I've seen a lot of people once again want to bench Jackson. Yes, of course, Bournemouth are a better team than West Ham. So, of course, there's the argument there that it's a different argument, right, compared to 2 weeks ago when I said that I would definitely not bench Jackson. But the way I see it really is that this Chelsea team is firing. They are at home once again, which I think is very significant. They have something to play for on paper right now. And ultimately, as I said, there aren't many opportunities where Jackson just gets subbed, right? Jackson can play multiple roles within this Chelsea offense. Even though Nkunku's coming back, even though you're seeing someone like Gusto play right wing, even though Sterling is back as well, the opportunities for Jackson to get subbed off early, I think, are very rare. And because he is one of those young talents, I just don't see him being an early substitute to, I don't know, celebrate Pochettino's season or whatever. So the way I see it is that Jackson is going to play very good minutes for this week, and I think he's a very good play. Whereas with Isak, of course, I think the question needs to be asked about, what is going on with Callum Wilson? He was out of the squad versus Brighton, so we'll probably get an update later this week. But if Callum Wilson is back, maybe that could muddy Isak's minutes on Gameweek 38. Maybe I'm also making excuses, I suppose, for Isak, but in reality, he should be someone that we expect to play probably close to 80 minutes once again. However, as you can see, obviously, in the previous two games, within the Burnley game, it was an interesting game because actually he only got taken off at 76 minutes because I think Newcastle were completely all over Burnley, and this was just a good opportunity to sort of rest Isak. With the Brighton game, however, it's a different case because I think that maybe you can argue he's played a lot of minutes recently. He could arguably be overtrained, maybe fatigued. But Wilson's out of the squad and he played 67 minutes in a game where they arguably wanted to win. So this is, for me, something that makes me doubt, I suppose, Isak's minutes, like the ceiling of his minutes in Gameweek 38. Is there a pretty low floor available in Gameweek 38 if they're not playing particularly well and he's not doing super well? I think that's possible if we're being completely fair to Isak. So the way I see it, a very simple fix is just going 3-5-2 because I prefer going for Olise anyways. And of course, I think in terms of, let's say, if I kept Gordon and wanted to replace Isak as a standalone pick, I think we have players like Gakpo who could be interesting if we found out that he started versus Wolves. At the same time, I think he's very prone to being an early substitution. We also have some other opportunities in the forward position, like, for example, your Munizes, your Matetas of the world as well. But I think I would still much prefer Olise over Mateta at this point in time. So, of course, if I'm just benching Isak, it's really a question between Mateta and Olise. And I think for me, Olise wins out. So I am someone who would probably side with Olise at this moment in time because I think Olise has built up enough match fitness to be probably the pick that I like the most out of this Crystal Palace team. So that is something to think about, right? Going Olise, going Havertz, those are the kind of ideas that are firmly within my mind. And I think that the last idea, I suppose, is what if I was to burn a free transfer? Because I think if I go for, let's say, benching Saliba in this situation here, I don't really think that I have a terrible team on paper, right? I've got Haaland here as my captain, of course. Why wouldn't you? Vicario and Porro to sort of maybe go for a slight differential here with backing Spurs in their final game of the season. Triple City, double Arsenal in this case, double Chelsea. And I don't think that it's necessarily a bad idea. And this is maybe if I assume that Isak is all good and he's going to play 90 minutes for whatever reason versus Brentford. I doubt this is what I'm going to do. I think it's very likely that I might swerve the Newcastle picks just to sort of buy into certain narratives and to play against the effective ownership of Isak. But yeah, this is obviously an alternative lineup that I can do, because another thing to think about too is when I talk about the sort of entering the 3-digit territory is that I do need to think about whether I want to use a transfer or not, because I've taken quite a fair few hits this season and additional transfers will actually decrease my rank potentially. So maybe there's a case where if I'm very tight around the 1000 rank, I might actually want to burn my free transfer in a crazy scenario where I think that it might reward me in terms of where I end up with rank. So something to think about, but probably something I'm probably not going to pursue at the end of the day. But every sort of move, I suppose, counts in FPL. So just worth mentioning that as well. But that's it for me this week in terms of my transfer plans. As I said, I'm firmly considering between, what to do with Saka, waiting for an update from Arteta on that. Otherwise, of course, keen to bench Newcastle players so that I can play Olise. And maybe alternatively, of course, if I'm very high on Isak for whatever reason, then I can just go Saka to Havertz as well. That could be interesting. Let me know what your thoughts are in terms of Porro versus Saliba, maybe even Gusto as well. But otherwise, I hope you guys have a lovely game week for Game Week 37 and hope the bench boosters are going strong. Take care and goodbye, and I'll see you guys in the next video.